Catalano. I'm a partner at Coughlin and Gerhart. I am the chair of our labor and employment department. So I handle all things labor and employment management side, representing employers, large and small employers, as well as municipalities throughout New York State on any variety of labor and employment issues. I think we've got an hour here today. I've got a pretty robust PowerPoint ready for today, probably more than we really need to get into. I know the main two topics I was asked to talk about today were pay transparency and exempt versus non-exempt employees. As you've done on the PowerPoint, that's what we'll talk about today. A lot of the PowerPoint is really background of how we got to the point of pay transparency. A lot of it I'll just kind of breeze over quickly because it's more just for your background information, and it's other things that go together with pay transparency that are good to know about pay and equal pay laws throughout New York State, federal law, local law, so on and so forth. And then obviously we'll get to the exempt versus non-exempt employees. This is a big issue I see frequently. I have a lot of questions about exempt versus non-exempt status. And it's got some real serious pitfalls if you do it incorrectly. Pay transparency, not quite so much, but the exempt versus non-exempt has a lot of liability if it's not done correctly. With pay transparency, one of the things I should know is that the state, so the law became effective September 17th. New York State issued its proposed regulations September 13th. So 4 days before the law was supposed to be effective, you're supposed to know and abide by the proposed regulations that aren't even complete yet. So there might be some changes after this, but this is kind of the status of the law and the regulations as we stand today. So we'll jump right into it, and please, if you have questions, jump in and interrupt me. I'm happy to answer questions as we go. I think it's probably better to be interactive. There's a whole lot of people logged in live right now, but if there are questions, I'm happy to take them as we go. For the next slide, the first slide here. So non-discrimination based on sex. Really the first key to it was Civil Rights Act of 1964. Title VII, as we basically refer to it on a routine basis. Title VII basically says you can't discriminate against somebody on the basis of sex. The Supreme Court has extended the term sex over years to include same-sex, transgender, sexual orientation, sexual identity, gender stereotyping. All of these things have been extended to be included within the definition of sex. This is a pretty basic one. I think almost everybody knows that under Title VII, you can't discriminate on the basis of sex. As a side note with it, included with the discrimination on the basis of sex is sexual harassment, including hostile work environment and quid pro quo harassment. The idea is you can't subject somebody to inferior terms and conditions of employment on the basis of sex. That's the general catch-all for all things sex discrimination is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. In addition to the federal law, we also have, you go to the next slide, please. We also have New York State law, the New York State Human Rights Law, same thing. It prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex, and it's even more robust than the federal law. New York State specifically includes the definitions of sexual orientation, sex stereotyping. Those ones aren't quite as clearly defined in Title VII, whereas they are under New York State law. Both New York State and federal law have a burden shifting framework where an individual has to claim discrimination. The employer has to then try to demonstrate, no, there wasn't discrimination, there was some other reason for the action taken. And then the plaintiff has to try to show that the stated reason was pretextual only and that there actually was discrimination on the basis of sex. So they're the same analysis, same framework, but they have slightly different definitions within them. One of the key differences for discrimination in New York State versus federal law is the standard of how bad the discrimination has to be to qualify. Under federal law, it's a severe or pervasive action. So if the activity is a one-off thing, it's got to be severe or pervasive to rise to the level of harassment. Example is if a coworker puts their hand on the other person's back one time, it's probably not going to be severe or pervasive. But in New York state law, the term is no longer severe or pervasive. The term is subjecting the individual to inferior terms and conditions of employment, which could be that hand on the low back or slurs or just different comments. It might not be so severe that it rises to the level of pervasive, but it could be something that subjects somebody to inferior terms and conditions of employment. So the lower bar under New York state law. New York City law, obviously we don't have a whole lot, I'm assuming here in Conference County, but it's good to know New York City law also has its own definitions for what is discrimination on the basis of sex. It really mirrors New York State by and large. There's really not any big differences that I can come up with. They're very, very similar for New York State and New York City, because New York State follows what New York City tends to do. Pay transparency is one of those main issues. So next we go over to pay equity. The Federal Pay Equity Act, the EPA, is encompassed within the Fair Labor Standards Act. Most individuals are familiar with the Fair Labor Standards Act. That's the law that basically created overtime, days of work, days of rest, that kind of thing. Then we'll get into the FLSA a little bit later when I talk about exempt versus non-exempt. But within the FLSA is the Equal Pay Act, which says you can't discriminate between men and women that are performing the same or similar, the same job. It's supposed to be substantially equivalent is the definition of the job. We'll see it changes a little bit in New York State, but the idea is if two people are performing the same work, you can't pay them different rates based on their sex or gender. Generally speaking, the evidence and the statistics show this really isn't the case. It's not a very common practice. Most employers that were paying people differently based on sex have been weeded out and have been sued into oblivion. So we don't have too much of this in reality. I know there's the issue of the pay gap that often gets talked about. A lot of times if you look at that, that's actually the career earnings and not actually comparing apples to apples for the most part. So statistically, pay equity isn't something we see a whole lot of. But again, it gets into this pay transparency and why pay transparency is kind of the new wave of the pay equity, which is why I felt it's appropriate to discuss the history here. With the federal law pay equity, again, you have to pay people the same wages regardless of sex or gender, with limited exceptions. If you go to the next slide. The exceptions for the Equal Pay Act are made, as you can see on the screen. It's when there's a seniority system, a merit system, or you're measuring it by a product. So it's something different than sex. If you hire someone that is a male that has 20 years of experience in the field versus a female with 1 year of experience in the field, they have the exact same job title, then you have a seniority system or a merit system. It's okay to pay them differently. You don't have to pay them the exact same wage. Now, if one person has a year and a half of experience, and that person has 2 years of experience, you might get away with paying a slightly different wage, but realistically, you probably want to have them very, very close in wages. And by the time they both reach that year 2 or year 3 mark, they should be very, very close on parity with each other, unless there's something else in it. Like I said, the merit system, if one person is drastically outproducing the other, then you might want to bump pay, but you want to have written policies for these things so that you can demonstrate if you're ever sued, you have the ability to demonstrate that there's a system and there's a reason why people are paid different wages. It's not just on a whim of we're just assigning wages on what we think somebody's entitled to or what we think we can hire them for. I can say I have a case right now, I'm defending an Equal Pay Act case where there's a claim of pay disparity between men and women. Well, the reality for my client is that they're two different positions, and the person suing, she's not in the position she thinks she's actually qualified for. But again, you have to have those policies and procedures and job descriptions, and it helps you to defend these claims when you have a claim brought under the Equal Pay Act. New York State also has a pay equity law. The New York State pay equity law is under Labor Law 194, and it's very, very similar to the Equal Pay Act under the FLSA. But now it broadly prohibits unequal pay for similar work. One of the biggest differences from my perspective between the federal and the state are the damages that could happen. Under either law, if an individual brings a lawsuit against an employer for a violation of the Equal Pay Act and they prevail in court, then the losing party, the employer, owes all of the attorney's fees for the prevailing party. Now, what happens in these cases is the individual, the plaintiff, might only earn a single dollar in damages, because the jury might think, we're not so sure about it, but we're going to give the plaintiff $1. You're still on the hook for 100% of their attorney's fees, which could be hundreds of thousands of dollars. So realistically, the only person that wins is the plaintiff's lawyer in those cases. The big issue, the big distinction between the two of them are, under federal and state law, there is liquidated damages. So what they say is, if the person was cheated out of $100,000, well, then you owe them the $100,000, plus you owe them another $100,000 in liquidated damages. It's 100% damages. New York State now allows for treble or quadruple damages. So if you're supposed to owe $100,000, you might end up owing that person $400,000 for not paying them properly, or for violating these laws. So there's some very, very significant wage issues and damages issues if things aren't done properly. Which, like I said, is probably the reason why we don't see a whole lot of these types of claims, because most people are aware of it, and most people aren't having these types of practices, at least that I see or I deal with on a weekly basis. New York State has the same basic exceptions to the equal pay law under New York State law: a seniority system, a merit system, something that measures production, or any other bona fide factor other than sex. Again, could be education, training, or experience, as the document shows. When it comes to education, I think that's going to be a tough one. You're going to want to show significant differences in education. It can't just simply be one person went to Cornell, one person went to Ithaca, so we're paying the person who went to Cornell $15,000 more than the person who went to Ithaca. You want to show it's bachelor's degree versus master's degree, or some other PhD versus master's degree. You want to show things like that if you're going to be using education as the basis for it. Now, it could be someone that gets a Bachelor of Arts that's not really applicable to your workspace, versus someone with a Bachelor of Science that's extraordinarily applicable. That could be a difference in education because it's less on-the-job learning. They're going to hit the ground running. But realistically, you probably want to use that more as a merit-based system versus the education-based system, because on paper, they're going to look very, very similar. So if they really do hit the ground running in a better way than their competitor, the other person that's hired at the same time as them, you're going to want to base it on their merit. What did they actually do in their performance while they were here after a year, as opposed to hiring them at different wages? When it comes to bona fide factor other than sex, the slide basically said part of the problem with this PowerPoint in particular is a lot of the stuff I'm discussing is just what the law says. So unfortunately, I'm going to be reading off of them more than I actually like to. But when it comes to the second one here, this shall be job related with respect to position in question and shall be consistent with business necessity. So this is where you can't just hire somebody and say, well, we're paying them more because they have a higher education, they have more education and more experience. Well, if their experience is auto sales and you're an industry of engineers, how is that connected to your business necessity? You've got to do something that shows there's actually a legitimate link between your business and what their experience or their skill is. And it's not just an excuse of, well, this person's been working for 20 years. Well, so what if they've been working for 20 years? How does that actually help your business? How does it justify paying them differently than somebody of the opposite sex? Slide. Bona fide fact other than sex shall not apply when the employee demonstrates that the particular employment practice that causes a disparate impact on the basis of sex. So part of the issue here is, if you can have an alternate subjective category or issue that you're using to base pay discrepancies or to change pay on, if it has a disparate impact, if it particularly impacts female employees or male employees in a negative way, you have to review and see, is there a different way we can achieve this goal? So if you're doing a merit-based system that is, you're giving wage increases or salary increases based on the amount of sales that your employees do in a year. If your statistics show that every single year, your male employees are getting a 10% pay increase and your female employees are getting a 1% pay increase, or there's a huge disparity starting to become apparent, it's going to behoove you to go back and look and see, why are we having such a discrepancy? Why is this impacting our female employees in a different way that's impacting our male employees? Is it we're giving better opportunities to the male employees? Are they just putting in more hours? Is there some other factor? So you're supposed to go back and evaluate and look at it. So you want to do a review of your own systems and see, why is it having a different impact? If on paper it looks like they're doing the same job and we're just giving raises based on production, why is one group having a more production than the other, and why is it having a negative impact on just one group? It's going to be detailed inside statistical look and figuring out, is there a different way we can achieve the goal that we want to achieve as an employer?
Is that something that would be the responsibility of human resources to continue to kind of audit and ensure that, you know, equity is happening across the board within pay raises and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, whoever's in charge of pay, if it's human resources, most offices, it's going to be human resources personnel that are going to be the ones to review that and see that. If they can go through and they can look at the end of the year with a CFO or somebody in charge of finances and say, okay, we budgeted for 7% wage increases for 2024. Okay, where are those actually being divvied up? And when we look at it and we see that the average male employee is earning 10% more than the average female employee, let's dive deeper into that. Let's see what's going on. Okay, all of our male employees have been here for 20 years, whereas our female employees have been more turnover, so we don't have as much experience and seniority. Okay, that could be a legitimate reason for it. But if you go through and say, no, all of our male employees and female employees were very similar in terms of how long they've been here, what their job titles are, okay, then why are we having this disparity? And you're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive and audit on your own and see what happens. It's not something that's going to be an overnight, you're going to notice it immediately. But if you do an annual review or semi-annual review and look and see, okay, we're having these different changes in pay that are not impacting everybody across the board in the same way. It might just be performance-based. There might be nothing to it at all. You don't have to change anything. Or you might realize, okay, we are having some issues here. We're giving the better opportunities to one group versus the other. We've got to figure out how to, and realistically, you don't even have to stop giving, if you're, let's use the example of you're giving sales leads, and it turns out the better sales leads are going to the male employees or the female employees. You don't necessarily have to shift who you're giving those sales leads to, but you might have to realize, okay, we're going to have to evaluate on a different scale. If we're getting a raise for every 1% for every sale over $300,000 for the men, maybe it's 1% for every female that's over $250,000. That's going to get more granular than we probably actually want to do. And then you have an issue of discrimination the other way, but you're just going to want to evaluate your systems and see, is there a reason this is happening? And if so, is there a different way we can achieve the goal of maximizing sales or whatever else it is you want to do without having this impact? And the answer might be no, which would be okay. But the issue is you have to look and see if there's a different way you can do it.
Is there any need to address any historical imbalances? Like if you do have men who have been there for 20 years, you know what I mean, and the females typically have only been there for a few years. I mean, for the longest time, you know, women were not being given the same opportunities as men to be in these higher level positions and therefore, you know, gain that type of seniority. So is there any way or any reasoning to or any need to address that legally when it comes to pay transparency, or kind of at least trying to right size what's happening as far as equal pay?
So you're stealing my thunder, that's part of what I'm gonna get to at the end, but that is exactly the stated reason for pay transparency. Is that you've got historically, if a male and a female have been in the same industry and the female's not being paid the same rate as the male, the problem is that they go to their new job and the issue is, well, how am I gonna pick where I wanna go? I wanna pick where I wanna go based on what they're gonna pay me, and they're gonna have to put on paper what they wanna pay before I even step foot in the door. Same thing with, and I'll get into it in a little bit, New York State banned asking questions about past pay. It's exactly for that reason. So you have two people come in the door and their former employer had some system that wasn't fair or just, and the male was making 100,000, the female's making 80,000. Well, if you walk into that new job, you can't ask them what their pay was, because you're not, that, if you do, the idea was that you're gonna pay the male, if he was making 100,000, you're gonna offer 105 to make him come over. Whereas for the exact same job, if the female is making 80,000, we're gonna pay her 85,000. So it's the same, okay, look on paper, we're doing a $5,000 raise. But it's because traditionally, perhaps in her old employment, she wasn't getting the same benefits and opportunities as he was. So it's kind of progressing that issue of the unequal pay. That's the concept behind pay transparency and outlawing any questions about past pay history inquiries. Okay, next page. Business necessity shall be defined as a factor that bears a manifest relationship to the employment in question. This is very similar to what I think I was just really getting into in the details here. You can't say, well, he's the head of the household, or his wife isn't working, so we have to pay him more to keep him happy. Otherwise, he's going to jump ship and go to a different employer. That doesn't bear relationship to the employment in question. It's got to be something more specific of, okay, we're going to justify paying this female 5 times more than her male counterpart because we need this role filled, and she's got the capability of filling this role. She's got the right background for it. It's a manifest relationship between the employment and the actual wage impact. Salary inquiry. Federal law, there is nothing under federal law that prohibits an inquiry into past salaries. But New York State changed its law 3 years ago, next slide please, that prohibited salary inquiries. So basically the bottom line of it is that you can't ask an applicant what their past salary was, what their current salary is at their current position. You've got to have, and the idea behind it is, as we just said, is to prevent any historical issues of not paying equally. By not asking that question, the idea is supposed to be the employer knows what they want to pay and what they're willing to pay for the job. It doesn't matter what the person's past salary was, because you should just know what you're going to pay for that job, regardless of whether you want to get a deal because they're paid less at their old employer or not, shouldn't bear any factor in you offering the position and what you want to pay that new position. So New York State outlawed any inquiry into salary histories. New York is one of the only states, I think it might be New York and California might be the only ones that ban salary history inquiries. So it's at the forefront of it. There's not a whole lot of case law on it because there's nothing federally. So it's got to be a New York State case that someone's going to sue under. And I really haven't seen very many, if any, reported cases on this issue.
Does this also apply to, I haven't applied to a job in a while, but I remember years ago, there would be like a box that says like, what would your preferred salary be? Is that kind of within the same realm? Is that?
It's not, but the idea of pay transparency should eliminate that, because we don't really care what your pay expectations are, because this is the pay that we are expecting to pay somebody. I think you can still put it in there, because if you put in there for if you put your expected pay for the position is $50,000 to $75,000, you can put in there, what are your salary expectations? And if they say 50,000, well, then you know they're at the lower end of of the spectrum. If they say 90,000, well, maybe they price themselves out, or maybe you do consider something higher, you realize, hey, our expected pay for this isn't on par with what the market's actually wanting for this. Every single person that's applied for the $75,000 job is saying that they want 90,000 or more. Okay, maybe we've got to bump our salaries because we're not actually meeting that threshold that we thought we were meeting.
Another question about that. So I have had in the recent past, like former employees contact me and say, I have this new job. They're asking me for my employment history. And so they want like all these details that I never in a million years would be asking people, you know, like what was the role, what were the dates that I worked, and can I have my last like 3 pay stubs or something like that. And I was like, what? Your current employer wants your pay stubs from us? Like, but they had already had like been hired for the position, and I've already been given them like the employment verification when, you know, they call and say, so says they work, like, you know what I mean? That step had already occurred. And so they're now an employee of this company, but at that point, they're being asked for their employment history. So, and I mean, which I thought was the most bizarre thing. And like that to me, and I mean, in a couple of those circumstances, I was like, you know, I would just go back and double check because I have to give you your records, but I'm not sure that you have to give them your records. And just from an advice standpoint, you know what I mean? Because that just seems so not in step with what this is saying.
I have not heard of that, so that's very interesting. Ultimately, in New York State, in private employers, private employment setting, an employee has no legal right to their personnel file. So generally speaking, I say, no, personnel files aren't disclosed to anybody absent a judicial subpoena that requires you to turn over their personnel file. If they send you a request and say, please turn this information over to so-and-so, nothing stops you from doing it. You're not buying lots, you're just doing what they've asked you to do. So,
but from that employee.
I wouldn't recommend you do that, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, I was like,
Yeah, I mean, I would never say that to the person who's calling me and asking for their records, because they're records, but
just, it just sent so many red flags up for me. It was very surprising and it felt not correct.
That's I certainly never heard of that. That's very interesting. Yeah, that's a very interesting scenario there. I agree with you. I wouldn't be advising anybody to reach out for that unless there's some kind of a lawsuit, you're trying to demonstrate their old wages versus their new wages or something to that effect. But even then, I would want a subpoena. If it's part of a litigated matter, then just send me a subpoena. We'll turn over whatever records you want to at that point. That's interesting.
Yeah, yeah. I agree.
Next slide, please. So with the state law, no employer shall rely on the wage or salary history when determining the new wages. So that's what we've already talked about. You can't ask orally or in writing for any kind of a salary history from the employee as a condition when you're deciding what you want to pay them. So again, the idea is, the concept is, know what you want to pay for the job based on what you think the job is worth, not based on what you think the applicant's going to accept. That's ultimately what your best friend and your best practice when it comes to these laws are, is what are you willing to pay? What does that job mean to you as a business? Not what's the cheapest you can hire someone to do the job for. And I should say it also, it does apply for promotions as well. It's not exclusively to new employees, it's for promotions as well. So if you have the employee's history, you're not supposed to look at it when you're making a determination about promotion, what you want wages to be. And if the person that's interviewing, if it's a large organization, you have someone interviewing the applicants for a promotion, and they aren't privy to that information about what their current wages are. Well, then they shouldn't be made privy to that information just for the purposes of deciding who we want to give the promotion to, and what we want to make the wages of that promoted position. So no employer shall request or seek the information verbally or in writing, and you obviously can't refuse to hire, promote, interview, or otherwise based on their wage history. So if they refuse to tell you their wage history, or if they just flat out tell you their wage history, you can't refuse to anything because you have that information or because you don't have that information. Now, ultimately, if somebody comes in and says, hey, I'm making $200,000 at this job, I want at least $200,000 for the new job, and you say, well, we're hiring a shop for $50,000 a year. Well, you can say, look, it's not worth our time to do this interview, but again, they're volunteering you that information, it's not you requiring for that information. And even in those situations, generally speaking, what's gonna happen is, you're gonna have a phone call to somebody, hey, your salary expectations are way out of what we were thinking for this position. Do you still want to have that interview, knowing full well that we aren't gonna even come close to what you're describing here? And it saves everybody's time, and it actually prevents those hard feelings and those offended feelings. Same thing, you can't refuse to hire, employ, or in any way retaliate against somebody because they don't provide you that information. It's just, again, it's the state law, it's just kind of regurgitating itself over and over, as laws tend to do. The bottom line is you can't ask about it, and you can't refuse to hire somebody to do anything adverse to the individual because they fail to disclose it or they don't want to disclose it, because you shouldn't be asking about it anyway. So who's an employer under the salary inquiry ban, salary history inquiry ban? A person, corporation, limited liability company, labor organization, or entity employing any individual in any occupation. So basically anybody. It includes state and political subdivisions, which most of the time, state and political subdivisions are not considered employers under New York State labor law. In this one, they are considered employers. The last bullet point here, I think, is the most important. It's anybody acting on behalf of the employer. That includes the agent, a recruiter, or otherwise connecting applicants with employers. So if you do a classified ad, I don't think they even exist anymore, but maybe they do. If you do a classified ad in the paper, and in that ad, you hire a recruiting agent to put that ad out there in the paper, and part of it asks for salary history, that's improper. The individual there, the agency, could be in trouble for violating the law, and you possibly can be in trouble for violating the law too, because you hired them to act on your behalf. So you've got to be cautious if you're hiring outside vendors to conduct recruiting efforts for you or advertising efforts. They've got to be cautious and have to be aware of these laws. So you probably want some kind of an agreement with them that they know when they abide by the New York State law, and if they don't, they're going to be indemnifying you for any violation if something happens. So applicant, again, means anybody who's taken an affirmative step toward employment with you. It doesn't actually have to be someone that comes in for an interview. If they have seen the advertisement and they start reading it and they go to your website and inquire and find out more, that alone could be sufficient to make them an applicant under the law. So if your website asks those questions, or the first line of contact, if they call into your HR and you ask that question, that could be considered a violation right away, even though they have not submitted a single piece of paper to you. They're just inquiring because they see an advertisement or they see an ad out there that someone is seeking employment. I'm sorry, you are seeking employment. They could be considered an applicant because at that point they've taken an affirmative step to seek employment, even if nothing comes out of it, even if it's not your formal submitting a cover letter or a resume or submitting an application or anything like that. Any affirmative step they take could rise to the level of making them an applicant, which again means you've got to be careful. You've got to have your advertisements out there, your job postings out there. All of that kind of stuff has to be compliant. You can't ask salary history questions on any applicant that comes in. Employers cannot request prior salary history information from current employees as a condition of being interviewed. Again, we've already talked about that at length here. It applies for current employees as well as outside individuals who are trying to become employees. Next slide. Oh, it's over there. I'm sorry. The exceptions. I mentioned this before, but somebody can voluntarily provide that information. if they just come in and they flat out just tell you. Now, the truth is, a lot of people are so used to it, or they so expect it without even knowing that it's the law. So when you say, what are your salary expectations for this job? They'll just flat out say, well, I was making 33,000, or I was making $17 an hour before, so I would at least $18 an hour now. That's perfectly fine. You're not doing anything wrong by asking them what their expectations are. If they just come out and, or right at the very end of the interview, any questions for us? Yeah, I was making $17.50. I want to make at least $18.50 if I'm coming here. Is that something you guys can do for me? Again, there's nothing you're doing improper because they're just disclosing that information to you. Now, you shouldn't use that information when you decide what you actually are gonna pay the job. If you originally were planning to pay $20 an hour and they come in and say, oh, I want 18 an hour. Well, then you should still pay them 20 an hour because that's what you're planning to pay for the job. Doesn't matter what their history was for their salary.
Can you ask them something like, we want to make sure that we're giving you a better offer or a positive, move from one company to another, or like,
It's like you're reading my mind. So
yeah,
the next
sorry.
bullet, no, the bullet right on here. An employer may confirm wage and salary history only if at the time of an offer of employment with compensation is made, the applicant or current employee responds to the offer by providing the wage and salary information to support a higher salary or wage offered by the employer. So if you offer them 20 an hour and they say, hey, I really like this position, but I'm already making $19.50. Can you bring me up to 21? That's not worth changing everything over to 50 cents. Well, then you can use that salary history because you've already made an offer. We're gonna offer you this job for $20 an hour. Okay. So you don't have their background information. You just offer them 20 an hour because that's what you expect to pay. Then they say, hey, I'm already making 21. Can you make it 22? Can you match it at 21? Whatever. In that instance, you can't. Now, you can't say it because you're thinking, I want to be a good person and make sure you're doing better. Then the onus is on them, the applicant of, hey, if you're interviewing or you think you want the job, but you're gonna take a step back financially, it's nothing against them saying, hey, I want this job, but you're not paying me enough. Then absolutely, you can use it as a factor then. But the idea has to be it's after you made the offer with a compensation package, and then they respond with, that's not enough, I need to have more. And then you can say, okay, then we'll pay you more because we really like the person. Which has other impacts, like when we get to the pay transparency at the end of this here, where it talks about what do you actually expect to pay for the position? Well, if your advertisement was 20 and somebody comes in and says, hey, I was already making 20 and I can't make this jump unless I make it 25. Well, now your job posting, instead of saying the expected pay was 15 to 20, maybe it's 20 to 25 or 22 to 27. You might need to make some other adjustments later on with the butterfly effect there. And then again, to that point, for current employees, employers may consider information already in the employer's possession as the salary and benefits paid to the employee. For example, an employer may use the employee's currently salary to calculate a raise, but may not ask them about it for their other jobs. So if the idea is we want to give everybody that's promoted a 5% raise, well, you're doing a percentage based on their former rate of pay, so you're okay to do that in that circumstance. And again, you're gonna make sure they're actually better off because it's a differential. If you have your baseline worker versus your line supervisor, we wanna make sure our supervisors are getting a little bit more, so it's an extra 25 cents an hour, it's an extra 5%, some kind of a differential there. It's okay to look back and say, okay, we're gonna base the new wage based on a differential of what the former wage was. But you can't go back and say, what did you have otherwise? Salary transparency, federal law, there is none, but New York State has pay transparency, New York Labor Law 194B. This was passed early in 2023, and as I said at the outset, it became effective September 17th of this year. So at this point in time, you need to be posting, if you're posting a job application or a job opening, you have to provide the good faith salary basis or what you're expecting to pay for that position. So you disclose compensation, a range of compensation, a job description, and benefits either for a new employment or for existing employee. So there's three components there. It's the compensation, the description, and the benefits. I think the benefits is less cumbersome. It's not something to be quite as concerned about. But the compensation and the job description are absolutely the most critical parts of this. So again, I apologize, I'm basically just reading law, but that's really all there is at this point because there's no cases on it and the regulations aren't finalized yet and the regulations are pretty sparse. So we don't have a whole lot to go with other than what the law itself just says on its face. A little bit late, long time here. So no employer employment agency, again, it's got the definition of who all the different people are that qualify as employers. To advertise a job, promotion, or transfer opportunity that will be physically performed, or at least in part, in New York State, including a job, promotion, or transfer opportunity that will be physically performed outside of New York, but reports to a supervisor, office, or other work site in New York, without disclosing compensation, and the description of the job. This second part here, I got stuck on my words here and fumbled my words, including an opportunity physically performed outside of New York or reports to a supervisor, office, or other work site in New York, has been really the biggest issue people have been concerned about. And the regulations are supposed to clarify, but they don't really clarify that well, in my opinion. The idea is supposed to be if you have an employee that's working in a Pennsylvania job and once a year they have to go to New York City for a conference, or once a year they have to come up and just have a meeting because your board of directors or trustees or whoever is working in New York and they have to show up once a year to have that meeting and report on what's happening in their office in Pennsylvania, probably not enough to qualify. But if they're working just over the border in Pennsylvania and all of their assignments are coming from somebody sitting in New York and they have to send everything back to New York to be reviewed before it goes out for final product, that's probably going to be someone that's covered under the New York salary transparency law. So that's really one of the biggest issues of the question of what is considered that they are reports to a supervisor, office, or other work site in New York. We don't really know exactly what that's going to be. My suggestion is err on the side of caution. If they are getting all of their work from New York State, they're getting everything they have to respond to and report back to us in New York State, that they're going to be an employee of New York State for this law, is my opinion on it. So unless it's just once a year, once on occasion, they come up and talk to somebody here, if they're doing work primarily out of the New York area, you're going to want to have this law, you're going to want to be pay transparency right at the outside.
So that's addressing like remote work too, right?
Correct. If somebody's working remotely and it's just, hey, this is a hybrid position, your work's coming from our office here in downtown Ithaca, you're working in Florida, doesn't matter. That's a New York job, you've got to post what that pay should be. Advertisements for jobs, promotions, or transfer opportunities paid solely on commission shall maintain compliance by disclosing in writing the general statement. The compensation shall be based on commission. So that one's got a little bit more wiggle room because it is based on commission. You still want to include, I think, what you expect someone to actually make in that position. An employer shall maintain the necessary records to comply. So basically, you keep your records. You can't destroy anything after you fill the job. You've got to comply with this, and you have to keep those descriptions, the job descriptions, as well as what you posted for your pay. And the idea here is supposed to be, if in September of this year, you're going to pay 15 to 20 an hour for a job, and then next September, it's 25 to 30 for people that are coming in. You want to be able to show, hey, we had these out there, but we had to change it because there was a change in position as to what people were expecting to pay. And then obviously you want to keep the job description. So job descriptions is a big one, I think, from my perspective. Again, I'm a labor employment attorney. I only represent management side for labor issues. Job descriptions are absolutely critical for all employers. This law hopefully is going to force people's hands to make better, more accurate, real job descriptions and update them on a routine basis. I can't tell you how many different laws and issues you have to relate back to what the job description is. ADA compliance, OSHA issues, pay transparency issues, Equal Pay Act issues, everything goes back to what is the job description and what are the actual job duties. Those are what you want to make sure you have updated on a routine basis and do an annual audit to make sure your job descriptions are actually accurate to what people are doing in their job. Because it's gonna come back any number of ways to help you or hurt you if you have a good or a bad job description. Range of compensation. That means the minimum and maximum annual salary or hourly range compensation for a job promotion, transfer opportunity. So what does it mean? It's supposed to be a good faith basis of what you actually expect. So what you do is you look, if you're hiring a laborer and you see that all of your laborers currently earn between 15 and 25 an hour, then realistically your pay range should be between 15 and 25 an hour because you know that's what the pay is going to be for that job. You can't say it's going to be between 15 and 60 an hour because there's some theoretical way we might be willing to pay somebody $60 an hour for this job. Or, you know, if you take our most senior people and they work overtime on a holiday, they're gonna earn $60 an hour. Well, no, that's not the way that it works. It's what do you actually expect the range of compensation to be? New York City came out with this law before New York State had it effective. And the day it came out, I was on Indeed looking to see what people were putting for their salaries, because I wanted to see, one, if people were complying with the law, and two, how are they doing a good faith range? I think it was Citibank that had some job description out there, and the range of pay was like $15 an hour to $2 million a year. And then they got called out for it, and they said that it was an error, was some kind of clerical error. They didn't mean to include that, but basically, there's a lot of companies, big companies, that when the law became effective, they put the biggest, broadest range of salary they possibly could. Okay.
And that's only the range of their entire, I mean,
Exactly.
not their entire company for Citibank, but I mean.
Correct.
A very large.
Correct, and that's what people were trying to do, so that's why New York's law tried to rein in a little bit of what's the actual job and why it's gonna be accompanied by the job description.
Okay.
So you're supposed to be posting what you actually think you will be, paying for the job. I'm like, run along here, so I'm gonna try and go through these quickly, I apologize. Employer, I think the key here is that it's employers with, 4 or more, sorry, am I in the right area?
Did I go too fast? No.
Employer shall mean any person, corporation, like acting as an employment. So again, it's one of those things where it's anybody that you have posting for you. If you have a marketing company that's out there recruiting for you, if you have a headhunter, a recruiter, they have to post what the pay range is for that. I skipped the page here, I'm sorry. So it is an entity employing 4 or more employees. So that's the key one to remember. It's only if you have more than four or more employees. So if you're a really little employer, you don't have to comply with this. Realistically, most are going to, because how do you expect to recruit somebody if they know what everybody else is paying and you're the only one that's not putting your pay range out there? Let's see the next one. Advertise, it's making anything available to a pool of applicants, internally or externally. So if it's a LinkedIn post, hey, we're hiring, you should have your job description and what your pay range is going to be there. If you post something on Facebook, hey, I'm hiring, come work with me, you should have your pay range and your job description out there. If it's a formal classified ad, obviously it needs to have the job description and the pay range. Indeed, anything like that you're actually posting out there, you have to include what the range of pay is.
Okay, clarification.
Yeah, super good.
So, I mean, like what you would put in an Instagram post or in an image-based post for that, normally you would be directing someone to the actual job posting where the job description and the pay range would be. You wouldn't necessarily include all of that in every single, like in all the posting language, because it'd be like a lot.
You should though. So if you're posting on Instagram, it's we're hiring. Your caption under Instagram should include what the job is, what the range is, and some of the job duties. It could say something of, go to this website for more detailed description.
Yeah.
But
like-
realistically, It can't just be, we're hiring, go to the website. It's gotta be, we're hiring for this position, here's the pay range. It's gotta be specific in every advertisement. So again, if we look at the definition of advertise, shall mean to make available to a pool of potential applicants for internal or public viewing, including electronically, a written description of an employment opportunity. Now, if it's just we're hiring with nothing else, you might be able to get away with it. But if it's we're hiring in our marketing department, we probably gotta have that job description and that pay range in there.
Right, and the post.
Yeah, this is gonna be one of the areas that's going to get, there's gonna be litigated issues of it. I'm hoping that the regulations come out with a final description that is more descriptive. But advertise is making it available, knowing that you are having employment opportunities out there. So it's very encompassing, it's very broad. Penalties, we'll just jump through. Basically, it's, if I remember correctly, it's got the citations to the law here. Basically, it's $1,000 for the first violation, $2,000 for the second, $3,000 for the third. But then you've got the issue of if an employee sues, they can potentially get more damages on top of it. That's the penalty from New York State for a violation. What the individual could potentially claim, I'm not sure what their damages would be, but they could file a lawsuit on their own behalf. We'll just skip right through. New York City had a similar law in November of 22. City of Ithaca had a law in September of 22 for the city of Ithaca. So the key takeaways here, we've already kind of hammered on them quite a bit. Adjust your protocols. Make sure you have salaries and job description. You've got kind of a posting out there. Review your templates. Review your job descriptions. Like I said, it's one of the number one things I harp on anytime I do any kind of a presentation or seminar. Having correct, accurate job descriptions of the actual job duties of what the person's actually doing is going to be your best friend in a countless number of legal actions when it comes to labor and employment issues. Train HR and supervisors. If they're listening to this, then they probably already on that. So good work keeping people trained and up to date with it. Next slide, if you could. Develop a process update. Develop a process where you're reviewing these things annually or semi-annually. Make sure you're updating it as you go through. And a pay audit, like I said previously, you might want to consider some kind of an audit to make sure you're doing everything correctly with your current employees. All right. Trying to, well, this is really going to be quick here. The materials have the key concepts here for exempt versus non-exempt employees. This is a very popular issue of concern. The problem is, just like pay transparency, it's very simple to say what the rules are offhand, but when it comes to the nitty gritty of what you actually have to do on a day-to-day basis, that's where it becomes difficult. So exempt versus non-exempt, I'm gonna do the 10,000 foot overview of what to think and what to be thinking about. Exempt employee means they are exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act and exempt from New York State law, from overtime compensation. There's other things that go into that as well, but the main takeaway is overtime. If they work more than 40 hours in a week, you don't have to pay them overtime. They're exempt from the law. That's the way to think about it. Non-exempt employees is the opposite. They are covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act. They are covered by New York State law. They aren't exempt from the law. So you have exempt or non-exempt employees. To be an exempt employee, you have to meet two criteria. You have to be a salary basis employee of a certain value, and you have to have actual job duties that are administrative, professional, or executive duties. And I'll get into that momentarily. But the big key one here that I have the definition for salary basis. This is a huge issue that it always shocks me how little understood salary actually is. Salary means that somebody is paid the exact same wages every single week, regardless of the amount of hours they work. That is what a salary is. A salary is not how much you earn over the year, it's not how much your average weekly wage is, it's not an aggregate of your hourly wages. Your salary is you are paid the same value every single week. It does not matter how much time you work or do not work. With limited exceptions, you have to pay a full salary to the individual every single week. If they work 1 hour, if they work 100 hours, it is the exact same pay every single week regardless. You can have a non-exempt employee who gets a salary. But if they're non-exempt and they get a salary, that means that they are getting paid that same salary every single week, even if they work 1 hour that week. But if they work 41 hours, you have to pay them overtime at the overtime rate for that extra hour. Anything over 40 in a week, you have to pay it. So you're getting the worst of both worlds. You have to pay them the same amount if they work less. You have to pay them more if they work more. Whereas a salary exempt employee, that's who we traditionally think of as a salaried employees. It's the same wage every single week, no matter what they do. You can have bonuses and everything else, obviously, but those are the main takeaways here. So the next slide here. So like I said, to be an exempt employee, you have to meet both of the tests. You have to be paid a salary. So you can't have an hourly employee that's exempt. It's that simple. They just can't have them. They have to be a salary basis, which in New York State is now $1,064.25, 55,000 and change a year. That is set to go up, I believe, in April. I want to say the number was like 68,000 annually. I can't remember the exact number. And
It might have been 58.
maybe it's 58. And
But
maybe
it's still considerable, like.
New York City, maybe New York City is going up because it was for a while there. It was a distinguished between New York City and upstate New York. Now I believe they're at the same level for New York City and upstate New York. But it is going up. The federal has attempted to move up the federal minimum wage as well. I'm sorry, the salary threshold as well. By 100, that's going to be killed in Texas like it was 7-8 years ago, whenever it was done last. So have to be paid a salary, has to be at least a 55,000 and change a year. And they have to perform the actual duties as executive, administrative, or professional capacity. So executive, primary, and I'm not going to read these because we're really short in time, but basically they're management. They have to be doing management type of work. Generally speaking, they have a higher level of education. They have to have the directing the work of at least 2 individuals, and they have the authority to hire or fire, or they're significantly influencing when they're making decisions about hiring or firing. Administrative, it's going to be similar. Primary duties consist of performance of an office and non-manual field work. They're not going out and doing things. They're not a foreman on a construction site. They're working in an office. They're actually doing day-to-day administrative type of work. They assist the employer in a bona fide capacity. So they're working with those executives or administrative individuals. That's going to be the administrative exemption. And then lastly is the professional exemption. Generally speaking, this we think of engineers, doctors, lawyers. It's someone with an advanced degree typically, and they're doing a lot of discretion and judgment in their work. These are not manual laborers. In order to be an exempt employee, you have to meet both of those tests. You have to have a salary, and you have to meet one of these job descriptions as an administrative, executive, or professional employee. There's a couple other entities or individuals out there that can be considered exempt, but these are the 3 main players we deal with. And I'll leave you with one last piece here because I know I'm out of time. There was a case out of someplace in the South where you had an individual working on an oil rig who was making an annual salary of $200,000 and change. The employer didn't pay overtime because he was a highly compensated individual. And the Department of Labor said, no, we don't care how highly he's compensated. He doesn't meet the job description and duties of an exempt employee. Therefore, you owe him overtime based on his calculated hourly wage, based on his $200,000 a year salary. And then you have to pay him overtime for every single week that he worked overtime. And you have to pay them those liquidated damages of 100 or 200 or 300%, depending on what. So this guy had a significant windfall because the employer had him categorized in the wrong group. So properly identify who your exempt and non-exempt employees are is absolutely critical. And it's gotta be, like I said, they have to actually be performing those duties. You can't just say they're administrative and realistically they're just copying and they're doing other things in the office. They have to actually be in an administrative job performing those duties.
Great. I'm sharing this screen. I did throw in the chat, if anyone has any questions, they can feel free to share.
I apologize that I went through a lot of the history to get us to where we stand today. I didn't think it was gonna take me that long, so I had to kind of fly through the main parts of what we're supposed to be here for, so I sincerely apologize for that, but I hope the background was helpful to understand where we are and how to think about a lot of these issues.
Absolutely. And I will share your contact info for those who are attending to send you any follow-up questions if they have any.
Absolutely.
And so once again, this is part of our learning series, which is sponsored by Tompkins Community Bank. And we are so grateful for your time today. And thank you all who are attending online. And with that, I'm gonna stop recording and say, have a great day.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.